This is part 3 of the Iron Islands. In part 1, I gave a general overview of the Iron Islands and how they were first settled. In part 2, I talked about life on the Iron Islands and their reaving culture. This video, let's start at the beginning of the Ironborn history and begin to work our way through their timeline, stopping at the height of their power. As with the mainland, the Iron Islands have their own legendary figure from the Age of Heroes, an era from which many Westerosi people and houses trace their history from. As the many stories from this era have been passed down from generation to generation through story and song, and with people knowing more myth than fact about this time, some dismiss these stories as fairy tales. However, the people of Westeros are still defined by these tales, and the Iron Islands are no different. While the Lannisters have Lan the Clever and the Starks Bran the Builder, the Ironborn all share one legendary figure, the Grey King. The Ironborn claim their islands were ruled by the Grey King, who was a single monarch named for his hair, beard, and eyes that were gray as the winter sea. It's said he ruled the sea and the crown he wore was made of driftwood, so that all would know his kinship came from the drowned god and the sea. It's also said he took a mermaid to wife so that his children could live above or below the waves as they choose. And because the Ironborn are perhaps a bit braggy, they attribute many great deeds to their Grey King. It was the Grey King that brought fire to the world by taunting the storm god until he lashed out with a thunderbolt, setting a tree on fire. He also taught men how to weave nets and sails and carve the very first longship from a hard pale wood of Ig, a demon tree who fed on human flesh. And I really wish we knew more about that tree. But despite killing a demon tree and bullying a storm god, that isn't considered the Grey King's greatest triumph. His greatest triumph is slaying the largest of the sea dragons, named Naga. This beast was so massive, it was said she fed on giant krakens and leviathans, and could drown whole islands in her anger. After killing this mighty beast, the king built a long hall from her bones, using her ribs as beams and rafters. There is some questioning if the creature he killed was actually a sea dragon, and we could probably question his wife being a mermaid too, but I'll let that one go. While petrified bones of a gigantic sea creature do stand on Naga's Hill on Old Wick, maesters aren't sure what the actual creature is. The ribs are huge, but they don't seem large enough to belong to a dragon that was capable of feasting on krakens and leviathans. However, given sea dragons haven't been seen in their known world for thousands of years, maesters don't have a good idea of what they're capable of, their actual size, or if they ever existed. If sea dragons still exist in their modern world, they live in the deepest, darkest reaches of the Sunset Sea. But of course, legends don't have to be truthful or completely grounded in facts. So regardless if it was truly a sea dragon, the Grey King ruled over the Iron Islands from his long haul for 1,000 years, and when his skin turned as gray as his beard and hair, he cast aside his driftwood crown, walked into the sea, and descended to the drowned god's watery halls to take his rightful place at his right hand. With the Grey King gone, and with him leaving behind 100 sons, a fight for who would succeed him began. It was an orgy of kinslaying as brother killed brother until only 16 remained. These survivors divided up the islands between them, and to this day all the great houses of the Ironborn claim descent from the Grey King and his sons, except the good brothers of Great Wick and Old Wick, who claim they came from the Grey King's leal eldest brother. But all this is the claim of the priests of the drowned god and their legends. Maesters have a different story, however. The oldest surviving records at the Citadel show that each of the Iron Islands was once a separate kingdom, each ruled by 2 kings, a Rock King and a Salt King. The Rock King ruled the island itself, making laws, settling disputes, and dispensing justice, while the Salt King commanded the sea and went wherever the island's longships sailed. It is believed the Rock King was almost always older than the Salt King, and in some cases they were father and son. This has made some maesters state that Salt Kings were likely no more than heirs, crown princes to their fathers, but that can't be true as some Rock King and Salt King pairs came from different houses, sometimes rival houses. Besides their 2 kingdoms per island ruling method, the Ironborn also had a unique method of choosing their kings back then. While the mainlanders chose their petty kings with their gold crowns through birth and blood, the driftwood crowns of the Ironborn were much harder to come by. Great councils called Kingsmoots were called to choose the Rock Kings and Salt Kings that would rule over them. They always gathered at Naga's Hill on Old Wick, and there the Ironborn made their own kings. As the Ironborn believed any captain is a king on his own ship, every man that owned and captained a boat was allowed a voice at the Kingsmoot. Interestingly, Kingsmoots were called by the prophets of the drowned god, and it can't be overstated how much power these priests had back then, and the great sorrow that befell any man that defied them. So when the priests called for a Kingsmoot to decide a new king after the death of an old one, or sometimes called to remove an unworthy ruler, they could last for days or longer, and were often a bit wild and unstructured. But the really cool part about the Kingsmoot is their driftwood crowns. Every king had a different crown, and when a king died, his crown would be broken up and returned to the sea. The next king would then make a new crown from driftwood freshly washed upon the shore of his home island. Because of this, every crown was different. Some simple, some small, some huge, some magnificent, and some large and unwieldy. And these gatherings of Ironborn to choose their Salt Kings and Rock Kings continued for some time before a priest, Galan Whitestaff, decreed that the Ironborn must not fight other Ironborn, they must not raid each other's shores or steal each other's women, and most importantly, he convinced all the Ironborn to unite the Iron Islands once again into a single kingdom. Whitestaff summoned kings and captains to Old Wick, and there they chose a high king to reign over the Salt Kings and Rock Kings of the islands. And from this, Yoras Greyiron, the Ironfoot, the Salt King of Orkmont, and the most fearsome reaver of that age, became the first man since the Grey King to rule over all the Ironborn. Whitestaff placed the driftwood crown on Yoras' head, and for many years he ruled. A little bit of trouble came when Greyiron died from wounds received while reaving. His eldest son attempted to seize control of the islands instead of allowing for a Kingsmoot. He proclaimed himself King Eric I, but Whitestaff, by this time feeble and half-blind from his advanced age, would have none of that. Instead, the prophet declared in a fury that only the Kingsmoot could make a king, and so once more people gathered to declare a king. Here, Eric the Ugly was stripped of being king and condemned to die. He avoided death by breaking up his father's driftwood crown and casting it into the sea, a sign of submission to the drowned god. In his place, Ragnar Drum, the Raven Feeder, the Rock King of Old Wick, was chosen. After this, a golden age would occur for hundreds of years afterwards for the Ironborn. However, the mainlanders that lived on the coastal areas might call it a dark age. The reavers of the Iron Islands attacked the coast of Westeros, seeking wood to build ships, food to live through winters, salt wives, and any other resources the islands lacked. Soon this practice of reaving turned to conquest, colonization, and rule. According to Archmaester Hereg, 111 men wore a driftwood crown as High Kings of the Iron Islands. And though the record books are incomplete and wrong here or there, it is believed the Ironborn reached the height of their power under Corrad the First Hoare, sometimes known as a Grey Iron and other times as a Black Tide. Corrad was known as Corrad the Cruel, and he ruled the Ironborn for almost 75 years, living to 90 and writing his name in blood in the histories of Westeros, boasting his writ ran wherever men could smell salt water or hear the crash of waves. By his day, the first men of the mainland of Westeros had mostly abandoned the shores of the Sunset Sea for fear of the Ironborn, and those that chose to remain on the coast paid tribute to the Ironborn. While the full extent of Corrad's bloody history isn't known, the major highlights included him capturing and sacking Old Town in his youth, where he brought thousands of women and girls back to the islands. At 30, he defeated the Lords of the Trident in battle and forced the River King, Berner II, to bend the knee and offer up sons as hostages. 3 years later, when his sons died at Corrad's hands, the king went to war, but the Ironborn and Corrad destroyed Berner and his host, killing the man and destroying House Justman. The Riverlands were then thrown into chaos. But as said earlier, Corrad brought the Ironborn to the height of their power, and with his death at 90, the kings that followed him led to the slow decline of the Ironborn. This decline wasn't helped by the first men of the mainland, who had begun to build longships and replace their wooden palisades and spiked ditches with stone walls. As the mainlanders grew stronger, the Ironborn further declined. In the next part of this series, I want to talk about the further decline of the Ironborn's power as the mainlanders fought back. Thank you for watching. Please hit the thumbs up button and come back for more Game of Thrones videos, Star Wars videos, comic videos, and more.